A McDonald's cashier helped a teenager who forgot his wallet. Days later, Melania Trump walked in and handed her something that left the whole restaurant speechless. The dinner rush had just started, and the familiar rhythm of beeping fryers and distant chatter filled the McDonald's on Fairfax Boulevard, Virginia. Inside, the air smelled of fresh fries and grilled patties, blending with the occasional burst of laughter from a group of teens by the soda machine. Behind the counter, Kimberly Wright, 27 years old, adjusted her visor and wiped her hands on a napkin. She had been on her feet for hours, but it was nothing new. Double shifts, aching calves, and customers who barely made eye contact. Just another day. She wasn't one to complain. Work was work, and she had rent to pay. A boy, tall and lanky, stood near the self-order kiosk, hesitating. He wasn't like the usual kids who barged in loud and restless. He kept to himself, hands tucked in his hoodie pocket, scanning the menu overhead as if weighing every choice like it actually mattered. Kimberly barely gave him a second glance at first, but as the line in front of her thinned, she noticed something odd. He looked lost, not in a confused way, but like he wanted to be invisible. She took a quick breath and called out, "Next!" The boy hesitated before stepping forward, finally locking eyes with her. His face seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. Maybe a customer from before? Can I get a quarter-pounder meal? Large." His voice was steady but quiet, almost like he was used to people listening without him needing to speak up. "Sure thing," she said, punching it in. "That'll be—" She stopped. His face changed, subtle but noticeable. A flicker of panic. He reached into his hoodie pocket, patted it down, then checked his jeans. His lips parted slightly, and he looked around, like he was hoping to spot a solution hanging in the air. Kimberly knew that look. She had seen it before. A wallet left at home. A debit card that suddenly declined. A kid realizing he didn't have enough for what he ordered. I think I forgot my wallet," he muttered, barely above a whisper. He avoided her gaze, shifting awkwardly, as if preparing for the usual options, either an annoyed sigh or a forced apology before turning back the way he came. The other cashier next to her glanced over, waiting to see how she'd handle it. Kimberly tapped the screen, deleting the order. "No problem," she said smoothly. "Happens to the best of us." He exhaled, relieved. But before he could step away, she spoke again. "Hey." She tapped the register. "It's on me." His eyes snapped back to hers, stunned. "What?" "Go ahead, get your meal," she said with a small shrug, as if it was no big deal. "You can pay it forward someday." For a second, he just stood there unsure. Then, cautiously, he nodded. "Thank you." Kimberly smiled and punched in the discount code herself, covering the cost with her employee meal credit. She handed him his receipt, pretending not to notice how he still seemed unsure of what to say. "Number 114, she called as she slid the receipt toward him. The boy took it, mumbling another thank you before stepping aside to wait for his food. He pulled out his phone, staring at the screen, but he wasn't scrolling, just thinking. Kimberly went back to taking orders, not giving it a second thought. She had no idea that small gesture would change her life, but in just a few days, she'd find out. The order came up a few minutes later, a brown tray carrying a neatly wrapped quarter-pounder, a large red carton of fries, and a drink sweating under the restaurant's fluorescent lights. Kimberly barely noticed when one of the kitchen workers set it on the counter. "Number 114, she called, already turning to the next customer. The boy stepped forward, hesitated, then grabbed the tray with both hands. He muttered another quiet, "Thank you." But Kimberly had already shifted her focus elsewhere, moving through the dinner rush like clockwork. He found a seat near the window away from the crowd and unwrapped his burger carefully. Almost too carefully, like he wasn't used to eating in a place like this. Every so often he glanced around, watching the room, his expression neutral but observant. Kimberly caught a glimpse of him in between customers. Something about the way he carried himself seemed different. He wasn't scrolling through TikTok or messing around on his phone like most kids his age. He sat upright, barely touching his food at first, like he was deep in thought. She shook off the curiosity and kept working. A few minutes later, a man in a dark suit walked in, scanning the room. He was older, mid-50s maybe, with sharp features and an earpiece tucked discreetly into his ear. He wasn't the usual McDonald's crowd, too polished, too aware. His gaze landed on the boy by the window, and in a smooth, practiced motion, he walked over. Kimberly watched as the boy looked up, eyes widening slightly before relaxing. So, someone was looking for him. The man leaned down and spoke in a low voice. The boy nodded, quickly stuffing the last bite of his burger into his mouth and grabbing his drink. He stood up, brushing crumbs from his hoodie, and followed the man toward the exit without another word. It happened fast. Too fast for anyone else to notice. But Kimberly saw it all. As the restaurant door swung shut behind them, she frowned. Who was that kid? And why did it feel like he wasn't just some random teenager? But before she could think about it any longer, she had an even bigger surprise coming her way. The rest of Kimberly's shift went by like any other. Orders kept rolling in, customers came and went, and by the time the dinner rush died down, the memory of the boy and the suited man had mostly faded into the background. She clocked out at 11:15 p.m., rubbing the back of her neck as she stepped into the cool night air. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few stragglers finishing their meals in their cars. She didn't think twice about the strange encounter earlier. People came and went. By the next day, she had almost forgotten about the whole thing. Almost. Something lingered at the back of her mind. The way the boy had barely touched his food at first. The way he carried himself. The way the suited man had moved with quiet authority. It felt off, but she had no way of knowing why. Life moved on. Kimberly went through her usual routine. Wake up, shower, throw on her uniform, grab a coffee, and head back to work. The smell of oil and fries was already seeping into her clothes by noon. She didn't mind. It was just another shift. That is, until she saw the same black SUV from the night before. It wasn't parked in a regular spot. No drive-through. No one getting out for a meal. It just sat there, idling across the street, tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Her stomach tightened. It had to be a coincidence. She turned back toward the counter, brushing it off. Customers were waiting. Hours passed. At some point, the SUV was gone, but Kimberly couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Something was coming. She just didn't know what. But the next day, she would find out, and nothing could have prepared her for it. The next afternoon, Kimberly was wiping down the counter between orders when the black SUV pulled up again. This time, it didn't just sit there. The back door opened and Melania Trump stepped out. Kimberly's heart nearly stopped. For a second, she thought she was seeing things. It wasn't every day a former First Lady walked into a McDonald's. But there she was, elegant, composed, dressed in a crisp white coat that looked completely out of place under the restaurant's fluorescent lights. The entire room went still. Conversations halted. Phones went up. Kimberly swallowed hard as Melania walked straight toward the counter. Toward her. The manager, a heavy-set man in his 50s, suddenly appeared out of nowhere, adjusting his tie and standing straighter. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering under their breath. Melania stopped at the counter and looked directly at Kimberly. "You are Kimberly, right?" The accent was unmistakable. The voice was calm, almost gentle. Kimberly's hands felt clammy. She wiped them on her apron. Yes, ma'am." Melania's expression softened. "I want to thank you." The room was so quiet that even the fryers seemed muted. Kimberly blinked. Sorry?" "For helping my son." Kimberly felt like she'd been thrown into cold water. Her son. She looked at Melania, then at the SUV, and suddenly it all clicked. The boy. The tall, quiet kid in the hoodie. The one who had forgotten his wallet. It had been Baron Trump. Kimberly's mind reeled. She had served countless customers over the years, but she never thought she'd unknowingly helped the son of a former president. But before she could even process what was happening, Melania reached into her purse and pulled something out. A white envelope. She placed it on the counter. "Please open it," she said. Kimberly's fingers trembled as she picked it up and slid out the card inside. Her breath caught. A handwritten note in elegant cursive. "Kindness is rare. You gave without expecting. That is why we want to give back to you." Tucked inside was a check, but the number written on it made Kimberly's legs go weak. The room erupted into whispers. Employees leaned in, trying to get a peek. But just as Kimberly's mind was spinning, Melania did something that no one in the restaurant could have expected. And that's when the real shock began. Kimberly's hands shook as she stared at the check. It wasn't a couple $100. It wasn't even a few thousand. It was $50,000. Her stomach flipped. This had to be a mistake. She looked up at Melania, words catching in her throat. I can't take this. Melania simply smiled. You already have. The restaurant was dead silent. Every customer, every employee, all eyes were on them. Someone behind the counter gasped. A manager whispered, "No way." Kimberly's knees nearly buckled. That kind of money wasn't just life-changing, it was impossible. Melania placed a manicured hand on the counter, her voice steady but sincere. You helped my son when you didn't have to. No cameras, no expectations. That is true kindness. Kimberly swallowed hard. I was just doing what anyone would do. Melania tilted her head slightly, as if she had heard that excuse too many times before. Not anyone, she said. That's why we are here. But then, before Kimberly could even begin to process what was happening, Melania turned and gestured toward the SUV. The back door opened again. This time, Baron Trump stepped out. He looked different, more put together than before, wearing a fitted jacket instead of a hoodie, but his expression was the same. Reserved. Thoughtful. He walked toward the counter, hands in his pockets, and stopped just in front of Kimberly. Hey, he said, his voice quiet but clear. Kimberly barely found the strength to respond. Hey! For a second he hesitated. Then, with more confidence than before, he extended a hand. I just wanted to say thank you, he said. Kimberly stared at his hand, still reeling. This had to be the most surreal moment of her life. But she wasn't about to be rude. She shook his hand, feeling how much taller he was up close. No problem, kid, she said with a small smile. The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. I never forgot what you said, he admitted. About paying it forward. Kimberly blinked. Yeah? Baron nodded. I think this is a good start. But what happened next? That was the part no one saw coming. The check alone was overwhelming, but before Kimberly could even begin to wrap her head around it, Melania spoke again. We wanted to do more, she said, her voice calm but firm. Kimberly barely managed a breath. More? What could possibly be more than $50,000? Melania turned to Baron, who nodded slightly before reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a set of keys. Kimberly's eyes darted between them, confusion tightening in her chest. What is this? She asked, her voice unsteady. Melania smiled gently. Your car, I believe, is not in the best condition. Kimberly felt her cheeks heat. It was true. She drove an old beat-up Honda Civic, the kind that rattled if you hit 40 miles per hour and leaked every time it rained. She'd had to call for jump starts more times than she cared to admit. She shook her head, stunned. Wait, how do you even know that? Baron gave a half smile. Let's just say, we did our homework. The restaurant was completely silent. A few customers had their phones out, recording, not in an intrusive way, but because they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Kimberly reached for the keys with trembling fingers. I don't even know what to say. Melania touched her hand lightly. Then don't say anything, just accept. Kimberly looked outside and followed Melania's gaze. Parked just outside the McDonald's, where the black SUV had been minutes before, was a brand new deep blue Toyota Camry. Her breath caught. A new car. A new car. Fully paid for. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She blinked hard, gripping the keys as her heart pounded against her ribs. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of an entire restaurant. She let out a shaky laugh instead, rubbing a hand over her face. I don't know how to thank you for this. Melania gave a small nod. You already did. Kimberly let out another breathy laugh, still struggling to believe any of it. She looked at Baron, shaking her head slightly. You didn't have to do this, you know. Baron shrugged, his voice even. Neither did you. And just like that, everything made sense. But there was still one more thing left to say. Kimberly gripped the keys, still feeling like she might wake up at any moment. The entire restaurant had been watching in stunned silence, but now, hushed murmurs filled the air. Some people whispered about how crazy this was. Others just sat there, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few feet away, her manager still looked like he might pass out. Kimberly took a deep breath, her voice steadier now. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay this." Melania's lips curved into the faintest smile. "There is nothing to repay." Kimberly looked down at the check, then at the keys in her palm. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Melania held her gaze, her expression unreadable but warm. "I think we do." Barron shifted slightly. He wasn't one for long conversations, but there was something in his expression, a quiet understanding. "You said I could pay it forward," he said. "I'm just doing that now." Kimberly let out a soft chuckle. "You did more than that, kid." A few people in the restaurant clapped. Others just sat there, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Melania gave a small nod and placed a hand on Barron's shoulder. "We should go." Barron extended his hand again, this time with more confidence. "Thank you." Kimberly shook it, still in awe of how a simple moment, something she barely thought twice about, had led to this. As Melania and Barron walked back toward the SUV, Kimberly just stood there, holding a $50,000 check in one hand and the keys to a brand new car in the other. Her life had changed in the span of 10 minutes. She exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together as she watched the SUV pull away, disappearing into traffic. Then, she looked down at the check again and let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. All of this over a $5 meal. She had always believed kindness didn't need an audience, that you help because you can, not because you expect something in return. But today, the universe had reminded her of something else. Sometimes the smallest gestures come back in ways you never see coming. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. A simple act of kindness, something we barely think about, can create ripples we never imagined. Kimberly wasn't looking for recognition. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just helped someone who needed it. And in the end, that small moment, one she almost forgot about, ended up changing her life forever. Have you ever experienced a moment where kindness came full circle? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because you never know, the next story might just be yours.